I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington, near Mount Rainier. It wasn't an official campground, just a spot way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected to see another human for miles. One night, I woke up and heard something. I opened my tent, and there was a guy sitting by where my fire had been, right outside my tent. There was nothing particularly noteworthy about him, just a regular-looking dude, sitting there a couple of feet away from my tent. No backpack, no gear, nothing. Just a guy. When he saw me open the tent, his eyes got huge, like he'd just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day, I managed to put it out of my mind, chalking it up to some odd encounter with a guy who was probably high or something. I figured he might have set up camp coincidentally not far from mine. Then, 2 days later, about 10 to 15 miles away in a totally random direction, somewhere no one could have accidentally ended up on the same path. I was sitting by the fire that night and started hearing noises. I became more and more convinced it was a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness, someone said, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said, "No, I don't even think that's a real place." They kept talking from just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that away." I was spooked and didn't want to piss off a potentially crazy person, so I did. After about 15 minutes of me being freaked out and them asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer. So, I shined my light that way again, and it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had to have followed me almost 15 miles over 2 days because there's no way he could have just accidentally wound up in the same spot. The wilderness is too vast for that to happen by chance. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again. I started to chase him, but I didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the dark, so I stopped quickly after probably only 100 to 200 feet. This encounter couldn't be written off as a coincidence because the only way he could have been in both places is if he was specifically following me. I can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the woods and to actually have to brainstorm ways to avoid potentially being murdered. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent, but by the time I mustered the courage to look, nobody was there. On the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first, but slowly it started to sound more like a human making animal calls. It could have actually been an animal, but it really sounded like a person making howling noises. I literally almost cried when I finally got back to my car. The relief was so strong. To this day, it was probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. I have no idea who the guy was or what his intentions were. There's no way of getting an explanation, but I can't really articulate just how terrifying those few days were. This experience happened when I was wild camping on my own in a forest in Wales. I live in England near the Welsh border, and this is something I've done dozens of times and continue to do to this day. It was April or May of 2013 or 2014. The weather was unseasonably good, and this was the second of 3 nights I had planned for my trip, though it ended up being the last. The first night and second day had been great. I got a lovely long hike in, followed by a pub lunch. I drove back to the area where I was staying and settled down for the night. I read a book, had some beers, and went asleep. It was probably between 11 p.m. and midnight. I was just in that state where you're semi-conscious, about to drift off but haven't quite yet. Slowly, I became aware of a melodic noise somewhere outside the tent. It didn't sound that close, but maybe within 50 feet. It sounded like a person perfectly humming a tune. After listening for a couple of minutes, it was definitely somebody humming. When I say perfectly, I mean just that. It sounded like a professional singer or something because it was perfectly in tune, with no voice breaks or falters at all. At this point, I was freaking out because it was just incredibly creepy, like something from a horror film. I hadn't left my tent yet, and the humming hadn't gotten any louder. It just stayed a distant background noise. I didn't know what to do but knew I couldn't just stay there forever. So I mustered the courage to open my tent as slowly and quietly as I could to see if I could tell where the noise was coming from, within 5 seconds of me poking my head out of the tent. The humming stopped. It didn't fade away or anything, it just stopped dead, as if someone had pressed pause on a recording. I was still very on edge at this point, but at the time, I assumed it was just somebody playing a prank on solo campers with an audio recording. I literally couldn't think of any other explanation. Based on that assumption, I shouted something like, "You're not funny, piss off." That made me feel a bit better because it felt like I'd addressed the issue. I don't know why, but for whatever reason, it helped my nerves a bit at the time. I let that hang in the air for about 10 more seconds while my head was still poking out of the tent, and it stayed quiet. I was kind of satisfied by this point. So I began moving back in. As I was reaching for the tent zipper, though, the humming started again, same tune, but much louder, much closer, and from the completely opposite direction. My heart completely sank because there was no way someone could have moved from the first source of the noise to the second without me seeing or hearing something. It was literally impossible. It was perfectly quiet in the woods, not even a breeze against the leaves, and yeah, it was dark, but I could still see short distances thanks to the moonlight. In the back of my mind, my subconscious was clearly working overtime trying to rationalize this. And I guess I must have assumed that there were multiple pranksters out there with multiple audio recordings. I can't exactly remember what my thought process was at this point because it's truthfully all a blur, but for one reason or another, I stormed angrily out of the tent toward the now quite loud sound. It sounded as if the person humming was within about 10 feet of the tent. I got up out of the tent, turned toward the noise, ready to scream at the perpetrator or even attack if necessary. That's when I saw this human figure silhouetted against the tree line, maybe 15 feet away from me. My best description of it is this. It was a large, thin figure that was shaped like a human but way too tall and proportioned all wrong. It was huge. I would have guessed about 7 feet tall. Its limbs were unnaturally long, like it had been stretched out in all directions. Its head appeared very small and rounded. I think the figure was gray in color, but I can't be 100% sure because of the poor visibility. I couldn't make out much of its face at all, it just seemed to be shrouded in shadow. I definitely didn't notice any features like eyes, a mouth, or a nose. It was standing quite still, facing directly toward me. I say quite still, because there was some movement in the same way that a person or animal would sway back and forth or make some minor body movements if they were standing up. This was a real, living thing. I know that for a fact. Not an illusion, not a prop or prank. This thing was standing right in front of me and was aware of my presence. I was literally paralyzed by fear at this point. I've never felt anything like it before or since, just a primal terror that left me cold, shaking, and standing there quite literally unable to move. I distinctly remember thinking that I needed to get away, but I could not physically move my body. It was the most terrified I had ever been. As I first laid eyes on this creature, the humming stopped, and immediately it started humming again, but not a song. It started softly singing my name in what sounded like my voice. That sounds ridiculous, I know, but I swear that's how I remember it. Even though it was singing in my voice, it didn't sound right. The syllables were just off, as though a non-human had heard speech once and was trying to mimic it for the first time poorly. I haven't described that well, but I don't think I know the words to do so. This can't have gone on for more than 10 seconds, but it felt like forever, me standing there, this creature standing motionless and singing my name. At some point, though, every cell in my body just switched, and I managed to turn and run as fast as I ever have in the opposite direction. For maybe 2 minutes, I was literally sprinting through the woods in just my socks and pajamas, with absolutely no other thought in my mind other than putting distance between myself and that thing. I had no idea which direction I was going or how I'd make it back to my tent. When I eventually stopped, I just leaned against a tree, panting for ages. The forest was still completely silent. I must have stayed by that tree for about 2 hours, waiting for my heart rate to settle, trying to calm down, and deciding what to do. I didn't want to go back to my tent. I was quite happy to leave all my stuff there, but I needed my phone and car keys to get home. I was several miles away from anywhere. I eventually made my way back slowly. It wasn't too hard to navigate back to my tent in those woods because the tree distribution wasn't very dense. I also hadn't gone as far as I feared. Once back in my tent, I grabbed just my phone and keys and went back to my car as fast as I was comfortable. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the back seat on my phone, shaking. I didn't even try to get any sleep. Once the sun was up, I managed to go back and pack my stuff up and left as quickly as I could. After that, I took a 2+ year break from solo camping, something I normally do every 3 to 4 months. So that's my experience. Make of it what you will. It has stayed with me ever since, and I know it always will. I don't know what was in the woods with me that night, but it has scarred me and transformed the way I think about supernatural experiences. If anyone has encountered anything similar to what I just described, I'd be interested to hear. Thanks for reading, and sorry this was so long. There's something up with the Appalachians. I've spent my life in Georgia and love hiking all over, but I must admit North Carolina has the best mountains for this reason. I frequently drive up there to hike and camp. This time, I went up with my family in an RV and stayed with them in Maggie Valley. The next day, however, I had them drop me off about 10 miles away at the Cold Mountain Trailhead. I planned to hike up, spend the night, and be back down in the morning. I was by no means inexperienced at hiking or camping, but I had never camped alone before. On top of that, I didn't bring a pistol, something I won't go without now. On the way up, the trail was surprisingly strenuous, not necessarily steep. I've hiked some steep stuff out west, but more like a ton of ups and downs, and it felt like it wouldn't end. Eventually, it began to get darker, and I realized I needed to stop and set up camp while I still had light. So, I stopped about half a mile short of the summit and figured I would continue in the morning. Nothing unusual happened at first. I set up camp in a really good spot, ate my food, and went into the tent. At this point, I realized I hadn't run into a single other person my entire way up. This wasn't eerie at the time, but it soon would be. I have trouble sleeping and usually lay awake for up to an hour trying to fall asleep. During this time, I thought I heard someone lightly walking around the general area. Because of the rhythm of the steps, I brushed it off as my mind running wild, but I did pull my big old knife out of my bag and put it next to me in the sleeping bag. That morning, I woke up and ate some oatmeal. As I ate, I looked over at my tent and noticed a strange bundle of dried twigs and berries tied with green cord propped against my tent. I'll see if I can find a picture and put it in the comments. Internally, I was freaking out because I packed my crap up and took off within 5 minutes. In no way was I bothered to go to the summit. I headed straight down. On the way down, I realized there was a pretty heavy fog, and I ended up on a side trail that eventually ended, leaving me lost. I used a compass to eventually reorient myself and found the trail again. One of the biggest reliefs of my life. I made it out with no other incidents. However, come to find out, the same morning, a 27-year-old died on the same section of the trail as me. It's possible I would have run into him had I not gotten lost and rejoined the trail later. His family seems to have scrubbed the internet of several of the articles about him, but I'll see if I can find something. The scariest part was knowing that someone knew where I was and watched me, and I had no clue about them. My grandpa encountered a wild man while ice skating as a child in rural Idaho. My grandpa was born in the last years of the 19th century and spent his entire life living in rural Idaho as a farmer and rancher. He had tons of old cowboy stories he would tell us as grandkids. Most of them were funny, some were cautionary, but a few were downright creepy. When my grandpa was 6 years old, he, along with his brother and a gang of kids from nearby farms, decided to go ice skating for the day. At that time, my great-grandpa was working as a ranch hand, and the family lived near Chesterfield, Idaho, now mostly a ghost town. It was a bright and sunny January day in 1902, and though the temperature was low, the sun kept things somewhat warm. They had hitched sleighs to their horses and headed down to the Portneuf River to ice skate. There were 8 kids in total, and they were excited to show off their new ice skates from Christmas. Along with my grandpa and his brother, there were 3 Robinson kids, Tommy Bayer, and the Guck twins. The best spot to skate was next to the Guck's ranch. The river there was broad and shallow, so the ice tended to be thicker, and if they didn't fall through, they would just get their legs wet. The kids spent a couple of hours ice skating when a loud scream came from a willow bush on the riverbank opposite them. The kids could only watch as a giant man covered head to toe in thick black fur came lumbering out of the bushes. He was carrying a large tree branch and was screaming in rage at the kids. They fled toward the sleighs, trying to scramble up the riverbank in their skates. My grandpa, being the youngest, was at the back of the rush. He couldn't get a foothold because of the skates and fell back toward the ice. The giant was now crossing the river toward them, screaming and swinging his branch. My grandpa was sure this creature was going to eat him. As my grandpa tells it, Lady Luck smiled down on me that day by the river, because as the giant was midway across the river, the ice gave way. It submerged his shins but was slowed down considerably as it tried to get back on top of the ice. This gave my grandpa's brother enough time to jump down and cut the laces off my grandpa's skates. They left the skates and dashed up the riverbank. Jumping onto the sleigh, as they looked back, the giant man was cruising the riverbank. To their relief, it didn't chase the sleighs. It just stood there, hollering at the kids and swinging its tree branch. The kids were able to make it back to the Guck Ranch, where they told their encounter to John Guck, the twins' grandfather. Word spread quickly in their tiny farming community, and soon a posse was formed to hunt down the beast. Where the kids had been skating, footprints almost 2 feet in length were found. My grandpa's skates were found near the tracks. They had both been bent in half like horseshoes. The tracks headed west into the nearby mountains. The posse followed them as far as they could, but deep snow prevented their travel any further. This creature was never sighted in that area again. This story captivated the small community, and soon word traveled across the country of the Idaho wild man. Here's a link to the newspaper article describing the event, 4th column over, 4th article down. That spring, my great-grandpa decided to buy a ranch in the Little Lost River Valley, farther north in Idaho. My grandpa had many other weird and creepy backwoods stories, but he always said that this encounter frightened him the most. He was sure he would have been killed if the giant hadn't broken through the ice and given his brother a chance to cut his laces. This happened many years ago when I was about 10 or 11 years old. I wouldn't describe the area I was in as backwoods necessarily, but it was a wooded, 100-plus acre ranch. The land is in the southwest part of the United States. My family owns the property, and we have family reunions every year, where we all stay for about 5 days to camp. There's an area of the ranch where we all set up camp, cook, and eat. Getting to that part of the ranch requires driving through a small village and several gates for about 2 miles. The first gate beyond the village is slightly past a set of railroad tracks. That's a lot of description, but it's relevant later in the story, because I had been camping at the ranch for as long as I could remember, and the land was private. My parents would allow me to go off on my own during the day as long as I didn't go too far. I spent time walking the property near our camp area, looking for arrowheads or trying to catch tadpoles in ponds. On this day, I left the large camp area after lunch, which was around 11:30, and told my mom I was going to a nearby creek. I planned on catching some tadpoles to bring back to camp and be back on time for a swimming trip with my cousins we were planning. They wanted to go to a nearby river, and I really didn't want to miss it. I made it down to the creek and got several tadpoles. I probably spent a total of 15 minutes down there. To get back to camp, I would have needed to either climb up a relatively steep embankment with a lot of loose rock or circle around on a longer route with a flat trail. I'd usually go up the embankment, but I didn't have a top for the water bottle I caught the tadpoles in and didn't want to risk slipping and spilling them out or killing them. I had never walked the longer trail by myself, but I had with my dad and felt confident I could find my way back to camp on it. As I walked back to camp, I had my head down, looking for arrowheads in the washed-out areas of the trail. I started feeling a little creeped out as I continued walking. We all know that feeling, like someone is watching. It was unsettling, but I chalked it up to just getting spooked by being on the trail alone. Now, the next part one can't explain whatsoever. It's as if a light switch was turned on, or someone snapped their fingers, and I came back to reality, except when I came to, I wasn't on the trail I had been on before. I was near the railroad tracks, and it was completely dark. My mom was standing in front of me, shaking my shoulders and yelling, "Where were you?" Two things I remember really clearly about the moments I came to are: 1. The look of fear, anger, and relief in my mom's tearful eyes as she was yelling at me, and 2. The confusion I felt about what the hell was going on. The last thing I remembered was walking on the trail back to camp, and now suddenly it was dark, and I was at the railroad tracks leading to the ranch, which was over 2 miles away. The best way I can describe it is to compare it to the movie The Butterfly Effect. The main character would be living in one moment, then suddenly he'd wake up somewhere entirely different. My parents drove me back to camp, and I learned it was about 10:30 p.m. This meant I had been gone for 11 hours, about 10 and a half of which I can't account for. To this day, my parents and all my family had understandably freaked the hell out when I hadn't returned to camp. They had been looking for me all day. I was a really good kid growing up and almost never broke any rules, so my parents were baffled at my behavior. I tried to explain to them that I had no memory of getting to the tracks, but they didn't believe me. They thought maybe I got lost and was embarrassed to admit it. This was the only time I'd ever experienced something like this. I can't explain how unsettling it was to not be able to account for all those hours I was gone. Was it a coincidence that I had been creeped out feeling on the trail and then just lost 10 and a half hours of my life? I wish I had answers for what happened. Has anyone else had anything similar happen? My grandfather experienced something in the woods and the answer died with him. This is a story that my mother and aunts told me when I was in high school. I'm 21 now, and it has never left me. I think about it constantly and ponder over what happened. My grandfather, Cale, passed close to a year ago in June of 2020. He was 96 when he died, and it caused some issues in my family. They don't really pertain to the story, but there are some things about him that I have to share in order to explain the story in the best possible way. My grandfather Cale was a man who was extremely gruff and old-fashioned. He was bitter, abusive, and a complete tough guy. My mother was raised on never showing emotion or pain due to his abuse and lack of compassion for others. He was also an extreme racist. He had many secrets in my family that are now coming to light after his death. Everything that happened around him was brushed off and forgotten because he had more important things to do, like drinking and having affairs. Just an overall intense and very stern type of man. He also was not religious at all and found things like faith and hope stupid. This story takes place sometime in the 70s, most likely early to mid-70s. My mom was born in 1965 and remembers this story very clearly. My aunts as well remember this happening, but no one knows exactly what year. One summer day, Cale decided to take his family on a small outing with the intent to have a picnic in the woods. My mother, her 3 sisters, and her mother, my grandmother, were all there and very excited about this. Where we are from, my family is more than accustomed to the woods and has lived in this area for generations. Going into the woods for a fun family activity was nothing out of the ordinary and seemed to be just another normal day. They made their way down to dirt back roads and stopped once they found a clearing large enough to accommodate them. As all the kids started jumping out of the car and messing around as kids do after being stuck together, my grandmother began unloading their supplies and picnic supplies. Cale began surveying the area and deciding where to set up. As he was doing that, something in the woods past the clearing caught his eyes. Before going to see what was out there, he yelled to the family and said he would be right back. The kids and my grandmother thought not much of this. They're all used to the woods, and these woods in particular were very familiar to them. They continued unloading and setting up the stuff they brought. One of the girls pointed out something in the clearing that caused a sudden shift from a normal day to something far worse. It was a dirt mound that looked like something was buried under it. This mound was about the size of a small person, maybe even child-sized. It was too big to simply be an animal in the woods. There was nothing but squirrels and raccoons in this area. Scattered amongst the mound were larger river rocks. There was no pattern, but they were definitely placed on the mound intentionally. Also, the dirt seemed to be fresh, as though just buried. It was loose and slightly darker than the area around it. The mood immediately shifted from an average day in the woods to something much darker. My grandmother became concerned and told the girls to stay away from it. She was clearly upset and worried about it, but did her best to ignore it. The girls, all being children, didn't have this same amount of worry and continued playing while just avoiding the mound. They tried to return to their picnic and the girls were already chasing each other in circles again. It was supposed to be a joyous sunny day, and my grandmother wanted to keep it that way. Things seemed to return to normal for a beat. The trees around them created a wall of dense foliage blocking their view from anything inside the forest. One of the girls again took notice of something strange. It was clear immediately what it was. Along one of the long branches of the tree hung a noose. It was tied with rope and hung high above their heads. A lump of dirt can be explained away by nature, but something had to have placed the noose there. My grandmother stopped dead in her tracks when she first saw it. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. They couldn't just pack up and leave. Kale was still out in the woods. Even children can recognize a noose as a symbol of death. The children started to become more anxious. Whatever innocence was keeping them from worrying about the mound had completely vanished. My grandmother, the resilient woman she is, soothed her children and told them it was just left by deer hunters, but she knew in her heart that they needed to leave. No deer hunter would hang a deer and then bury it, at least no sane deer hunter. It wasn't until they started hearing something in the woods that they began to really panic. My grandmother, as well as all the children, began hearing a rhythmic chanting from deep in the woods. It sounded as though they were a group of people all singing in deep voices to the beat of a drum. It went in a quick bum-bum-bum pattern. 3 steady beats followed by a pause, and then it would repeat. It sounded far away, for immediately fear began to take hold of each of them. They each listened and gathered together. As the seconds passed, it began to increase in volume. It was getting not just louder but closer. What started out as a distant echo soon began to engulf the entire clearing. My grandmother was terrified and wanted so desperately to leave, but Kale had yet to return. They waited, fear-ridden, as the sound began to fill their chests. It felt like they were at a concert as the deep bass began to vibrate in their chest. It was everywhere and constant, as though the sound was being made by the trees themselves surrounding the family in every direction. Suddenly, the sound of yelling broke through the constant drone of chanting. Kale's voice was yelling out to them from the trees. "Go," he yelled. "It in the car." He came running out of the woods yelling that they needed to leave. They had never seen terror on this man as they had at this very moment. He was a man afraid of nothing, unbothered by the world around him. This was the most emotion any of them had ever seen from him. He saw something in those woods, something that shook his very being to the core. My grandmother began throwing everything in the back of the car as the kids got in as well. Kale and my grandmother picked up their things and as quickly as possible threw it all into the car. They had no care for the things they were packing up due to their fear. Food was all over the trunk and items were broken. After everything was tossed in, they both got in the car and drove away. This is where the main brunt of the story ends, but one fact from this story is what really has caused me to wonder all these years. My grandfather has refused to ever speak of what he saw. He never told any of the children or my grandmother. Every time this was brought up, he quickly rebuffed it and angrily told them not to ask again. He never went to the police or told someone outside of the family. My grandfather is the only person who knows what happened that day. When I first heard the story, I swore to myself I would ask him one day. Now I can't, and I regret it greatly. By the time I was in high school, he had moved out of the state with other family members, and I mostly lost contact with him outside of occasional happy birthday calls or letters. This story doesn't have an answer to go with it. When he died, the only thing I was sad about was never knowing what happened that day. We weren't close when I got older, and once I learned all of the abuse he caused, I separated myself from him. His death looms over me, and this story still haunts me to this day. My mother and aunts just look back on it as a spooky memory from their childhood, nothing more than a story to spook the little ones at Thanksgiving with. I am one of the only people in the family who is still curious about what had happened. I've always been interested in mysteries, the occult, horror, and conspiracy theories. This story piqued my interest more than any others in my family, which, by the way, this isn't the only strange story for my family, but it definitely is the most strange. I wish I had answers. I hope you all find this story as fascinating as I do. I will gladly answer any questions, and I would love to hear theories about what was in the woods. In the summer of 2012, I took a job as an expedition canoe guide on the Boundary Waters in northern Minnesota and Quetico, southern Ontario. It's a massive wilderness area of lakes and land. I was working for the Boy Scouts, and we were based on Moose Lake on the U.S. side. My job was to facilitate a fun and safe multi-day trip, anywhere from 7 to 12 days out. Most of that summer was typical, but one expedition in particular still haunts me as a result of what happened to us over the course of a few days. Here's the account. My crew was on the younger side. There were 9 of us in total, the maximum allowed in a group per our permit. There were 6 scouts, 2 adult advisors, scoutmasters, and myself. They wanted to do a 200-mile trip but didn't have the physical ability, so we had to amend our route. They were all bummed out, so I decided to take them to a waterfall called Eddy Falls. It's pretty flat up there, so a waterfall is somewhat rare, but that decision would end up putting us in the path of something. We visited the falls and camped near them that evening. I had the boys working on camp setup while the advisors worked on the fire for dinner. I was collecting firewood in a big tangle of downed trees, brush, and bramble. I could faintly hear the falls off to my left when, out of nowhere, I heard the most unearthly scream/roar I've ever heard. It stopped me dead in my tracks, and I was frozen. The second scream was closer, and the third closer still. I couldn't see anything due to the thickness of the brush, but whatever this was, it was coming directly at me. By the fourth scream, I could feel it in my chest. I got nauseous and involuntarily barked. I've never before or since heard that sound come out of my body. The fifth scream almost physically hurt, but it snapped me back to reality, and I ran back to camp. My crew had luckily heard it too, but what was I going to tell them? I claimed it was a boar. There's no boar up there, and the advisors knew I was lying but didn't call my bluff. After dinner, they went to their tents, and I retired to my hammock about 50 yards from camp. As a rule, I always set my hammock at about head height, so about 6 feet up. I would use a tarp over my body and head to keep the morning dew off and the morning mosquitoes at bay, but the tarp wasn't strung up that night. That's important. It was just loosely over me. It must have been about 3 to 4 a.m. when I was awakened by what sounded to me like a woman sobbing, not an outright cry, but a sob. At the same time, I heard something walking through the thick brush down past my feet. I listened, totally still and quiet, as it crossed into camp. I could hear the change from brush to granite rock, but could still hear its heavy footfalls as it walked right through camp and on toward me. At this point, the tarp was still over my head, so I couldn't see a thing, and I didn't know what to do. In no time, it was standing right next to me. I could hear the breathing, long and congested sounding. I could smell the musk. I could feel its enormous presence only inches from my body, just standing there. Time to make a decision. I suddenly threw the tarp off my head, and as I did this, my left hand touched this thing in the chest. It was dark, but I could make out briefly a very large, upright figure. The hair on it was long and coarse. The musculature was impressive, bodybuilder status. Pictorial is what I touched. It all happened in a second, and as soon as my hand made contact, it bolted back into the brush with immense speed for such thick debris. By the time I got my headlamp on, it was gone. My crew had slept through it, so I read until sunrise and decided not to mention it. The next day, we moved on a few miles toward base camp and camped on a small island. Campsites on the U.S. side are designed with a fire pit and a grumper, which is a fiberglass toilet over a deep hole. We were just arriving, and it was evening. One of the adult advisors needed to visit the grumper, so he walked toward it. About 2 minutes later, we heard him yelling, and he came running back to camp, still pulling his pants up. He said that he'd just seen a gorilla run right in front of him. I asked if maybe it was a bear, and he said absolutely not, that he'd hunted bears for years, and it was not a bear. It was a monkey, and it was about 9 feet tall. At this height estimate, I'm imagining being back in my hammock. If I touched the chest and I was about 6 feet off the ground, that puts the head close to 9 feet up. Was it stalking us? Was there more than one? The boys were now scared. Time to mitigate. I suggested a night paddle. No one was sleeping anymore anyway. So we packed back up and set out around 8 p.m., paddling by headlamp for several miles. My plan was to get back onto Moose Lake and camp very near to the bay so we could be the first crew off the water the following day. Moose Lake is connected to Newfound Lake by a small pinch and a channel of water that's not very deep or wide. There's dark woods on both sides. We were right in the middle of the pinch when a rock the size of a basketball came flying out of the woods on the right side and narrowly missed the bow of the canoe I was steering. There's no cliff there. This was forcefully thrown at us from the tree line. We paddled like hell. We paddled to the center of Moose Lake, tied all 3 canoes together, and sat out there all night. With the sunrise, we paddled to the base camp and ended our expedition. They did not want to talk about what happened, and I was okay with that. They left for Oklahoma the next day. After they left, I went to work a shift in the canoe yard, helping crews offload. My buddy, Yarrick, got back that day from a trip in the same area, Bear Loop, and I was helping him put a boat on the rack. I noticed he had a distinct look, almost 1,000-yard stare. I asked him how his trip went, and he said it was all good until they hit Knife Lake or Newfound Lake. He said they were being messed with for 2 nights on Knife, and then had a rock thrown at them in the Newfound pinch. Sure enough, for 2 weeks after that, crews kept coming back from that area with very similar stories. One night, there was a crowd of us guys in the staff lodge swapping trail stories, and these encounters came up one after another: screams, rocks, sightings of apes. Then, from the back corner of the room, I heard a chuckle. It was one of the old veteran guides who'd been there for over a decade. All he said was, "It's about time somebody else seen one." I asked how long he'd known they were there, and he said he'd been encountering them for 10 years. Then he said, "They talk to me." This shocked me. Like, a language? I asked. "No," he said. "They communicate telepathically. The less you acknowledge them, the less they'll bother you. But they can read you, and they like it when you're afraid. It's like a game to them." What happened out there is still a big question in my mind. I've always been open to the idea of Sasquatch. Their existence was never a huge stretch for me, but what really sticks with me is the way that veteran guides spoke of their intelligence and parapsychological abilities. That they can read human emotion as clear as pages in a book, that they know our species better than we know ourselves. I'll start this off by saying I grew up completely 100% adamant that the paranormal isn't real. I believed it could all be rationalized and that people who believed in it hadn't thought about it hard enough. I've made other posts on other subs about paranormal events that have happened in my life recently that have completely changed my mind, primarily about my neighbor's house. That's not what I'll talk about today, though. I live in the Midwest. I live on a small rural lot between a cornfield and a small forest and a camper. I've lived in this county my entire life, and I know the entire area like the back of my hand. That being said, I've come to the conclusion that my experiences around the rural and wooded parts of this county are crawlers. I'm 100% sure of it. I've had many encounters, not back to back, but they happen frequently. There's a forest or park in the middle of the town I've always hated at night. Since I was little, I felt uneasy there. As I got older, my cousin and I thought getting scared was really fun. We'd go there at night on purpose, but we never lasted long. I always felt like I was being watched. This, on top of urban legends of people going missing there at night, made me feel really uneasy. Fast forward to a few years ago. I got married, and I'm settling into life as a husband. I take my large, all-black German Shepherd, Fenrir, on walks with me at night. I always walk toward the park, but I usually don't enter it. The first time something weird happened was about 5 years ago. I was walking Fenrir, and in the woods to the front and right of me, to the left and behind me was a neighborhood edge and a small playground, when, suddenly, my dog started acting super anxious. He's usually a very stoic and quiet dog. He's 120 pounds and built like a tank, looks very intimidating, and he knows it. I heard rustling in the woods following me, and I felt like I was being stalked. I ran home, and that's the end of the first encounter. I had a few more encounters like that, but last year, things really amped up. I was on a walk around 11:30 with Finra, my wife, and our little newer dog, Booger. He's a terrier chihuahua mix. We were walking down the same path, and about 3 blocks away from the woods, 4 or so deer came sprinting out of the trees into the street toward us. They seemed terrified. Then, I heard what I can only describe as what sounded like a human trying to mimic the sounds of a monkey. I thought it was really silly until recently when I read that other guy's story who heard the same damn thing. We laughed it off as some kids playing around. Once we got up to the woods and were walking parallel, we could clearly see 2 reflective eyes and a silhouette staring us down from the tree line. We also heard a deep growl and then a hissing sound, but it wasn't super high-pitched or anything. Both our dogs acknowledged this as well. Finra stared, and Booger growled a bit. I made a Facebook post on the community's Facebook group, and other people told similar stories about around town. Around this time, I got a job as a tour guide/maintenance for rail explorers. I'm working there again this year as well. We start April 1st. Basically, they take in used or tour-specific railroad sections that aren't used federally and have these pedal carts with motor assist on them you can use to explore the tracks. It's super cool and super fun. The one I work at is like 5 minutes from where I live, and it goes through the woods and an inaccessible part of the county, unless you float down the river and hike up steep, loose dirt hills. You go under one old car bridge and over 2 multi-hundred-foot-length old train bridges. The first one is larger and taller. It's about 150 feet off the ground above the forest. The second goes over the river, about 6 months into the job, and it's fall. We work until midnight sometimes, with the last tour leaving around 9 p.m. That means the last tours for the last 2 months of the year are in complete darkness. The way the job operates is with 6 employees, 4 get on the lead bike, and 2 get on the rear bike. From the lead bike, we can drop off 1 person at the busy intersection as they can flag traffic, and 1 person gets dropped off at the large train bridge that goes over the woods. The person at the bridge gives a short safety speech to the customers who stop and go one at a time over the bridge. The employee carts are much faster than the customer ones. We all have walkie-talkies, and we usually have these battery-powered floodlights on stands we can use so the customers can see us and light up safety vests. On one particular night, we were behind by 20 or so minutes. Instead of leaving the depot at sunset, we were leaving at dusk. I was stationed at the high bridge. By the time we reached the bridge, it was pitch black, with only the stars providing a little light. My coworkers dropped me off and waited with me until the first customer arrived. I gave the little speech to that first cart, and I chatted with them for a bit, trying to buy some time and wait for the next customer cart so there wasn't a massive gap for my coworkers, who have to flip the bikes around. After a few minutes, I let the customers leave, and I was alone. I was alone for 20 minutes. I used the radio so many times, but it was static for everybody. One of the only times we've ever had an issue like that. I kept seeing movement in the tree line. I kept hearing fast footsteps all around me in every direction. I had the floodlight on above my head so everyone and everything could see me, but I couldn't see crap. I turned off the floodlight and used my personal flashlight. I kept seeing quick glimpses of pale skin moving quickly, but right when I started seeing stuff, I could hear the next customer cart coming close. So, I turned the light back on and waited for them to come around the corner. When they pulled up, I noticed they had a little boy with them, and he's scared of the dark. I'm terrified at this point, but I have to act appropriate, even more so because of this boy. I don't want to scare him. As I'm finishing my speech, I hear movement right behind me and say, "Jesus freaking Christ," and spin around with my flashlight on instinct. Poor kid. I told them it was probably just a deer, and they're good to go across the bridge. The same night, the person stationed at the intersection, this isn't like a town intersection, it's very rural, next to a massive cornfield. He's Native American and was very in tune with this creature. He told me privately a few weeks later that he heard rustling in the cornfield, and whatever was out there was whispering his name and trying to get him to the field. He was also without communication for those 20 minutes, but he wasn't in the woods and could see a lot better than me. Another time, me and the same coworker were headed back on the front cart. We were way ahead, so we stopped the cart in the middle of the high bridge. It sounds scary. I'm a bit afraid of heights, and this bridge has massive gaps between the planks you could fit through. But after doing it so often, you get used to it. It was a clear night, and we were watching the stars and having small talk. Then, it goes silent. We are 100 or so feet in the air above the woods. We can hear for miles. The dogs barking across the river 2 miles away can be heard without even seeing houses. We hear what sounds like a human mimicking a monkey noise, and we hear growling. He looks at me completely serious and tells me in a stern voice that we need to get off the bridge right now. I drive the hell out of there, and he moves states to Nevada shortly after this. A few other things happened here, and they're to coworkers as well. Each of my coworkers has at least one story. I'm only sharing mine in this post. Otherwise, it'd be too long. A few months go by, and it's late fall, around the middle of November. I drive through that park in the town a lot when I just want to go for a drive. I had my dog Finner with me, and it's around 2 a.m. I can't sleep, so I'm listening to a Melvin CD and driving leisurely through the park. As soon as I get past the entrance gates, I feel really uneasy and weird. I'm not easily scared, but going to the park at night makes me feel a primal fear. It's beyond fight or flight. I've never felt that way in my life anywhere else ever, and I feel it every time I'm there. I'm driving through the park, and I've rolled up the windows a lot more. Finner can still poke his head out but can't leap out. As I go deeper into the woods, I feel worse and worse. I decide not to turn around because I'm already past the halfway point. Turning around would make me stay in the woods longer. I start speeding where there aren't turns I can't see around. I come around the last corner, and what I saw made me have nightmares for months. There was a pale, skinny humanoid, tall and lanky but not quite human, crawling on its hands and feet, but it was crawling fast as hell. Like 20 miles an hour type fast. We don't have bears here. The only animals that size are large dogs and deer. That wasn't a deer. It went from my right, crossed the street, and went into the tree line. Finner saw it too. He doesn't bark at animals, not even other dogs, but he went ballistic. He was trying to force himself out of the small gap in the window, nearly foaming at the mouth and snarling. He never ever acts like that. I'm a certified dog trainer, and I've raised him from birth. Most recently, I've become obsessed with this park. I've walked there at night from my camper to the park with Finner. I'll never do it again. I didn't see a figure this time, but as I was entering the park, a massive owl flew by my head, so close I could have smacked it mid-flight. This made me feel weird for the same reason. As soon as I get to the park, I feel extremely weird, anxious, and nauseous. I walk a few hundred yards to the only streetlight in the entire park, and I turn around and face the woods. Me and Finner stand there frozen for like 10 minutes. The silence was deafening, and any time I heard anything, I jump. Finner was anxious as hell too. He kept staring into a certain spot in the woods a ways off. I swear I saw eyes in there every once in a while. I built up the courage to walk out and haven't gone back since. It'll be interesting to see what happens at my job this year. I wanted to add that the county I live in is packed full of abandoned mines, hundreds of them.